internet, and welcome to another one of my translated videos. I usually do these in German, so if you are into weird ramblings about video games and strange accents, you've come to the right place. Today I'm gonna review the Sega Flashback 7 HD, also known as the Mega Drive HD, or in the US known as the Genesis HD. I owned quite a few clone consoles in the past, and by clone consoles I mean basically reimaginings of old classic video game consoles that were put on the market by weird third-party developers many years after the originals came out. Those little machines usually suck because they are never quite as compatible as the originals and are basically to be considered hardware trash. So mine, after a trial period, always go back on eBay after a while. So for me it was a little miracle when Nintendo decided to release their own versions of their classic consoles with the NES and the SNES Mini, and both of those machines are great. I can actually recommend them to anyone. They have perfect emulation of the classics, and they both feature a great library of classic games. And since those two little machines did such a great job of taking me back to my childhood, I actually thought, oh well, since I already have the NES and the SNES Mini, I would like to revisit some of the other classic consoles I owned, but in HD. And so I was very happy to see that Games put out a new version of their Flashback console, and this time it features an HD MI output, and so I went and bought it for around €100, and I guess it is available in your country for about $100. And here it is, in all its glory, the Mega Drive HD, also known as the Genesis HD, and this one is actually the European version, and it features all three Mortal Kombat games that were available for the Genesis. There's also a specific German version, and in that one, those three games were removed because I guess they were deemed too violent. But I'm happy that I got this one. It features 85 games, and I believe this is the same collection you get in the US. And it's quite a nice collection actually, because it features some of my favorites from back in the day, like all four Alex Kidd games, I believe, and all four Final Fantasy games. And I remember I played the second Final Fantasy game back as a kid, and it was actually the first game that made me cry because the story was so touching. Let me show you what's in the box. And of course, first we have the console itself, which looks pretty much like a standard Mega Drive Genesis, but it is a bit smaller. But the good thing is it still has a cartridge slot, so you can use your old games, and you can even use your old controllers because it has two ports for those classic Sega Genesis controllers from the 90s. Then we have two wireless controllers, which are a little smaller than the originals, and you need a tiny screwdriver to open up the battery compartment, and you also need those stupid AA batteries which are never around, at least not in my household. You get a standard HDMI cable, and you get of course a power supply, which I would guess would look a little bit different in the US. And that's pretty much all there is in the box. Small instruction manual, but basically that's all you get. Not a lot in there. After playing around with the system for about 10 hours, my final verdict on the controllers is they are just okay. And the reason for that is because they use infrared technology, which is pretty much an ancient way of connecting your controller to your console. So there's a bit of lag and they're not always reliable. But still, they're alright, and they now feature a rewind button, which lets you rewind time for 6 seconds if you made a mistake in a video game. This is not a Genesis Mini, as you can clearly see when you compare it to the current Nintendo Mini consoles. This is still rather big. Basically, when you put the NES and the SNES Mini next to it, it's basically as big as both of them together. Even when I put this thing next to my original Genesis consoles, it's not that much smaller actually. And by the way, if anyone can explain to me why one of my old Genesis consoles is twice as heavy as the other one, please do so in the comments, because I'm really curious about this, what the difference between the two is. It's time to take a closer look at the insides of this machine. And of course, this is not original hardware. This was not produced by Sega. It was made by Ed Games. And they produced a little box with a chip inside of it that simulates a Sega Genesis. And I have to say, the menu is kind of confusing. It doesn't allow you to navigate in a way that would make sense to a normal person, but it still kind of works. The nice thing is that you get information about each and every game that is on here. 85 games sounds like a lot and like a great value. And even when you compare it to the SNES and the NES Mini, which offer 30 games and I believe 21 games on the SNES Mini, this looks like the best deal you could ever get. But you should be aware of the fact that some of the games on here were never released for a classic Sega console. They basically were just added here as filler, and it's actually the ones hiding behind the menu point bonus games. And all of those were either made by Ed Games or by semi-talented programmers, probably just by single programmers actually, because they really suck and should not be played by anyone, in my opinion at least. It's all indie titles, basically inspired by classics like Froggers and similar games like those, but they're just not worth playing. And those games basically make up 19 of the 85, or roughly 1/4. As for the rest of the lineup, it's mostly Sega Genesis games, as you could guess when you look at the console. It's 45 of them to be correct, and there's also 19 for the Sega Master System, and even 7 games that were originally released for the Sega Game Gear. I guess they did that to have like complete series on the system, and yeah, most of them are good, really good actually. It's a good lineup, it's quality games, but what's weird to me is that some genres are missing. If you are a jump and run fan, or if you are a fan of RPGs, you'll get a good deal here. But as for the rest of them, not so much. Actually, there's no sports games on this, which is weird because the Sega Genesis was also always known as a sports game system. But I guess they just went for the Sega originals and nothing by EA or any other publishers. I'm not a big expert on emulators, and actually I'm so old that I don't remember the classics correctly, probably. So I cannot tell you how accurate this emulator is that is on this box here. And if you want to know if there are any frame rate drops or graphical errors, you have to look somewhere else. I cannot tell you. It looks fine to me, mostly. The only issue I had with this system is that it sometimes crashed on me. And by crash I mean the picture froze and I had to restart the console, which is really annoying. But I also have to say it is really easy to save here. Usually saving a game takes about a couple of seconds, and you can easily access your saved games also quite quickly. So it's all okay to me, and even though this system isn't perfect, I could get a lot of gameplay out of it. If you want perfect gameplay, as you remember from your childhood, then you would have to get the original console and the original games. As I told you before, this system features a cartridge slot. So I just grabbed a couple of games from my collection randomly, and I basically just chose games that were as different as possible. So I chose some Japanese stuff and some European stuff, some American stuff, and most of it worked, which is nice. Because this system actually doesn't differentiate between different regions. You can play mostly anything on this one. But there are a couple of exceptions. VR racing or virtual racing didn't work for me. Everything else I picked worked. If you want to get a list of compatible games, you should just look online. I'm sure there is some site that lists them all. If you are a real collector and if you are into weird stuff, I guess you will have to look each and every single game up, because there's probably some weird Japanese things that won't work and some weird collector's items that won't work. Probably aftermarket games like the Sega Genesis games that came out in the last couple of years won't work on this system either. Everything else, like the common stuff, is fine. So, if you are into common Sega Genesis games, you can get this system to play them in HD, which is nice. I like it. I have one last complaint, and that is the fact that this system does not offer a lot of options. Basically, the only thing you can do is add scan lines to the picture, but you cannot go full screen on some of those games, and that is kind of annoying to me. Let's get to the verdict. And I have to say, I like this system. It is not great, it is not crappy, it is somewhere in between. And I have to say, it really spoke to me on a nostalgic level. I got to relive some of my childhood memories, and I would expect you to do the same if you grew up in the 90s. So, yeah, there is some problems with this. I didn't like the controllers with the infrared connection, and the selection of games is kind of weird to me. But still, it works fine for me. The crashes are annoying that occur, but there is a lot to discover here, and you can have hours and hours and hours of fun, especially with the good role-playing games that are on the system. If I had to put a number on it, I would give this one a 6.9 out of 10. This thing is definitely not as good as the Nintendo Mini systems. Probably because it wasn't made by Sega, but by Ed Games. But still, it is great fun, at least for me. So, I hope you enjoyed the video, have fun gaming, and I hope to see you around again. Bye!